Okay, yeah. Boy, I'm a mess today.
Good evening. I hope you can all hear me. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. We have a very special lecture, which I will talk to you a little bit about, but the person that usually does the presentations and the introductions is to my left, to your right, so I will do the housekeeping that he normally does. First of all, on Saturday, which is Halloween, we will be taking a group of people from NAASR up to the Whistler Museum in Lowell to view the Arshil Gorky exhibit. And Sarah Bogosian will be giving us a talk, and then we will go out, we will go to the Whistler and view the beautiful paintings in there as well as this jewel of a museum, and then have lunch and come back. So we still have spaces available, and if you are interested and have not signed up, Kathy will take care of you in the back. Also, as you know, we have a plethora of lectures this season, but the next one coming up is on November 3rd, and Professor Armin Mamigonian will be here, and the title of his lecture is At the Crossroads of Family and Institutional Memory, Marsovan, which is Merzaphone, and Anatolia College, 1890 to 1922. That is being sponsored by Project SAVE, Anatolia College, and NAASR, and we hope you'll come. That should be a very interesting lecture. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our lecturer this evening, and I'm very happy to see his family here as well. I think most of you know our lecturer this evening, Marc Mamigonian. It's the tall fellow over there to my left. And as I said earlier, he's usually the one introducing the lecturers, but when he was kind enough to give tonight's lecture, I said, Marc, you know, I really would like to welcome you this evening. He said, okay, that sounds great. So here I am. It really is a pleasure. Most of you, as I said, know Marc. I've known Marc since my tenure here at NAASR, and I can't imagine working with a finer young gentleman. Not only is he bright, but he's respectful. He is someone whom I respect greatly, and I know he's very well respected within the academic community as well as in the Armenian American community. Pardon, can you hear me okay? And loved. He is loved, yes. He is loved. Usually we reserve that for his wife to say, but there are different levels of love. And yes, we all love Marc. So, you're loved, Marc. I just want you to know that.
Noted.
Just a little bit about the background of Marc, even though you've probably read about it, but I would like to take a couple of minutes to just tell you that Marc received a BA from the University of New Hampshire in English and Poli-Sci back in 1990. And then he earned a master's from Tufts University in English Lit in 1992. He worked at the BU James Joyce Research Center from 95 to 97. And as most of you know, he is a Joyceophile, if I may use that phrase. No, he loves James Joyce. He's written many articles, co-authored several scholarly works on James Joyce, and he also has given several classes at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, and he's currently doing so right now. He co-authored, I have to read this, Marc, because you know I'm impressed with your CV here. He co-authored with John Turner several scholarly articles, as I mentioned, and interestingly enough, he was the author of an article on Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and the Armenian Genocide, published in the Armenian Genocide, Cultural and Ethical Legacies, which was edited by Richard Hovannessian, whom you all know. It was originally presented at the 2004 International James Joyce Foundation Conference in Dublin. And then we came to 1998. When Marc first came through the doors of these hallowed halls. And at the time, Mamigonian was the chairman. And Marc came to NAASR, and I believe you spoke with Manug, and Manug very, very intelligently offered him a job. So, if it were not for Manug, Marc would not be here. But I also might say there's a little bit of nepotism because Marc and Manug are related. I'm not sure what the relation is, but you
that's
know,
a whole other lecture.
Okay, that's But anyway, Marc has been with NAASR since 1998, and we're thrilled to have him here. Just a few things that Marc has done on the Armenian side as far as conferences. He was a participant most recently in the 2008 workshop on Armenian Turkish scholarship in Geneva, Switzerland. He was a participant in the 2008 workshop on the state of Armenian studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He chaired a panel on the state of Armenian study chairs and programs in the U.S. at the March 2009 conference for Armenian studies given by the Society for Armenian Studies at their 35th anniversary conference. And we're very proud to say that Marc was recently elected to the Executive Council of the Society for Armenian Studies, and we're very proud that they asked him and that he was elected. He represented NAASR and participated in the first international conference of Armenian libraries at Etchmiadzin recently in August of 2009. And as you all know, he is the editor of NAASR publications, The Armenians of New England and Rethinking Armenian Studies, and the Journal of Armenian Studies. So, without any further ado, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to present Marc Mamigonian, who's going to be giving a very interesting talk with some, I think, interesting recordings and handouts on the development of Armenian studies in the United States. So, my pleasure to present Marc Mamigonian, our Director of Academic Affairs at NAASR.
Well, thanks. That's strange. Roger, could you kill this light here? Yeah, that one. Thank you. I can still see, and you'll be able to see the board better. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. It's very nice to see you all here tonight. In the more than a decade now that I have worked here at NAASR, I've become very interested in the development of this field of Armenian studies that we all have some interest in. And obviously I have a particular interest in NAASR's role in the development of the field, which has obviously been substantial since the mid-50s when NAASR was established. But I've become aware through poking around that there were earlier attempts to put Armenian studies on the map in the U.S. And what I would like to do tonight is give an overview based on ongoing research of the gradual fits and starts development of Armenian studies before NAASR's creation, and then to give some history of NAASR's own early contributions to establishing Armenian studies in the U.S. on a permanent basis. And I would like to dedicate this talk tonight, if it's not presumptuous of me to do so, to a few things. To the 50th anniversary this year of the successful completion of the Harvard Chair fundraising campaign, which took place in May 1959, about which more later. And to all of those who worked so hard in those days, be they NAASR people or otherwise, to establish Armenian studies in this country, but especially, because you have to narrow it down a little bit, to the first three NAASR founders, Ara Avakian, Thomas Amirian, and Manuk Young, who the latter of whom is here tonight, I'm very happy to say, and to all the men and women in the august group of NAASR founders, some of whom are shown here. It's quite a distinguished group. I'm especially grateful to Manuk, who has shared with me so many recollections of the early years of NAASR, and to Haik Dermanwalian, who has done likewise, and to Richard Fry, who has also, and J. Michael Hagopian, Dikran Kuyumjan, and others who have given me a sense of the development of this field. And I would like to continue this rather long-winded preface by stating that what this lecture tonight is not. It is not an exhaustive history of Armenian studies in the U.S., because much more work needs to be done on that. It's not an exhaustive history of NAASR, because we don't have time for that. It's not a chronicle of all the endowed chairs in the U.S., Hopefully by the time I've wrapped things up tonight, it will be clear what it is, but maybe by then it won't matter anymore, but let me get on with things. I'm very fortunate that within these walls here at NAASR is a repository of information about the history of Armenian studies since the association's creation in 1954-55. But finding details about Armenian studies in the U.S. Prior to the advent of NAASR has proven rather challenging. For many years, there were only a couple of published articles chronicling in any detail the history of the field. Nina Garsoyan's Armenology in the USA, published in Russian in 1971, and Dikran Kuyumjan's The Status of Armenian Studies in the Diaspora, published in Armenian in 1972, were among the only serious attempts to document the history of the field. This situation improved recently with the publication of Vartan Matiosyan's valuable article, The Beginnings of Armenian Studies in the U.S., the Armenian Quarterly, which provides valuable information on Gostan Zaryan's involvement in the 1940s effort, which Matiosyan calls the first phase in the history of Armenian studies in this country. But I would have to say that it's necessary to revise that date backwards a little bit because it started earlier. What we would call Armenian studies has been established in Europe at least since the time of Napoleon, but it came much later to the U.S. According to the Bulletin of the American Society for the Advancement of Armenian Studies and Research, about which more later also, Armenian, both the modern and the classical language, has been taught at Columbia since 1894. I've not yet had the opportunity to verify this, and unfortunately there's no one around anymore who took any classes there at the time. But the most likely instructor, and it was Eden Nabi who suggested this to me, would have been the famous Indo-Aranist A.V. Williams Jackson, who pops up in our narrative again a little bit later. He taught, as the caption says, from the 1890s until his death in the 1930s, Indo-Iranian languages and related subjects, and was a distinguished scholar of his time. Another noteworthy but isolated early episode that I've found a little bit of information about was a series of lectures delivered by Reverend A.A. Badikian at the University of Chicago in August 1919, including talks entitled The New Problem of Missions in the Near East, The Plymouth Rock of Asia Minor, and The Destruction and the Reconstruction of a Nation. Badikian would later recall in a letter to Manuk Young that he taught and lectured for 7 years during the summer quarters at the University of Chicago, my alma mater. His alma mater, not my alma mater, even before there was any talk of Armenian studies anywhere except in Europe. Badikian would go on to teach Armenian classes at Columbia in the 1930s. I don't know exactly what years he did that. I have not found that out yet. Badikian would also be involved in several other efforts to be taken up later in this paper, including NAASR. He served on the first NAASR board of directors and served for some time on our board. Unquestionably a pioneer in Armenology in the U.S., Robert P. Blake's interest in and involvement with Armenian subjects dated back to 1910 when he studied under Nikolai Marr in St. Petersburg and ventured to eastern Armenia and to Mount Ararat. Blake was at Harvard from the 1920s until his death in 1950, and as early as the 1928-29 academic year, he offered a class called Armenian Historical Documents. He taught Byzantine history as well, and would later give courses in the history of the Ottoman Empire and classes in Armenian and Georgian in the Department of Comparative Philology. Blake remained active until his death, and in many ways he paved the way for the permanent program in Armenian Studies at Harvard established in the 1950s, especially through the efforts of one of his later students, Richard N. Fry, who was a catalyst to and a founder of NAASR. Together, Blake and Fry translated The History of the Nation of the Archers and published it in the late 1940s. Fry took over the teaching of Armenian language at Harvard after Blake's death, in addition to teaching other classes. Professor Archibald Coolidge taught a class in the 1920s that I've come across entitled The History of the Eastern Question, which after his death evolved into the history of the Near East in modern times, under his former student, Professor William L. Langer. I don't have any specifics about Langer's course, but in light of the extensive and at times controversial treatment Langer gives to the Armenian question in his 1935 magnum opus, The Diplomacy of Imperialism, one assumes he must have covered the Armenians in the class as well. In the 50s, Langer was among the founding members of NAASR. He describes his involvement with the organization and with Marc A in particular at some length in his autobiography, In and Out of the Ivory Tower, which I can tell you is for sale in the NAASR bookstore. Sirapri Dernesesian came to the U.S. in 1930 and began as a part-time lecturer at Wellesley, eventually becoming a full professor and chair of the Department of Art History. She gave a notable series of lectures at Dumbarton Oaks in the late 1930s on Byzantine sculpture, and from the mid-1940s until her death, she was affiliated with Dumbarton Oaks. Her book, Armenia and the Byzantine Empire, A Brief Study of Armenian Art and Civilization, published by Harvard University Press in 1945, is a groundbreaking work, one of her many important studies. There's no question that Dernesesian was a pioneering figure and a giant in the field. Mention should also be made of Cyril Tumanov, who studied with Blake at Harvard, and also under Nicholas Adonce in Brussels. Tumanov began teaching on Russian and Caucasian subjects at Georgetown in the 40s, and one of his major works, Studies in Christian Caucasian History, published in 1943, still stands as a definitive work. There's also a lot in that book about the Mamigonians, so it's of particular interest to me. However significant the work of these individual scholars in the 20s and 30s may have been, and this short list should not be taken as an exhaustive one of those whose research touched upon Armenian subjects. There was, as far as I know, no attempt to establish permanent Armenian programs or professorships, until, that is, 1933, when an effort was inaugurated that yielded very little in the way of tangible results and was thus largely forgotten. I initially became aware of this undertaking when I found a letter here at NAASR from Matthew Callender, who in the 1940s and 50s was a writer for the Armenian Mirror Spectator, among other things. Does anybody remember him? Mean anything to anybody? Van? Yeah. To Avadis Darunian, John Roy Carlson, whose papers reside up above our heads here. In this letter, written about the time of the launch of NAASR, Callender wrote, in part, I have vast material for a series of articles as to what has been done about such a project as the vitally necessary Center of Armenian Studies. I also know how the unfortunate event, that of the unspeakable murder of Archbishop Turian, coinciding with the date of the launching of the project, set back in 1933. I also know how the 1946 effort was brought to naught by Jaregian, again at Columbia, and also because the Ramkavars suddenly pulled out of the efforts to bring to success the vast project. The young Mr. Young, that would be Manu, has been known to declare that the present project must be a combined effort by all parties, including the Tashnaks. If Vertanes has already sent you the photostatic copy of a letter of H. Kurdian, an ARF, dated December 26, 1933, written to Vertanes, in which he beseeches to beware of including any Tashnaks in the 1933 project. Well, the letter by Kurdian, to which Callender refers, does not contain quite as explicit a warning as this would suggest, but what Kurdian wrote is, please be careful about the selection of Armenians for membership. I'm referring to the sad and shocking affair of the wanton murder of the Archbishop on Christmas Day, a crime committed not only against all human and social standards, but also against Christ and God and all the holiest traditions of old Armenia, an ugly and inexcusable crime for which I hope the utmost punishment will be dealt by the authorities of New York City. I do not think you should take Armenians unless they are well-known authors. You have an Armenian Studies Society without Armenians. And authors of articles whose subjects, ideals, and findings are such that are acceptable to the board of the new forming organization. This letter was written to the Reverend Charles A. Vertanes, who was born Yesnik Aznakian in Alexandria, Egypt. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister and was the director of the Armenian National Council of America from May 1945 on. His papers also reside here at NAASR. In 1933, oh, it's the battery for the camera. Okay.
Sorry.
Someone, yeah, Michelle. In 1933, Vertanes was a graduate student at the Union Theological Seminary in New York and served as the executive secretary of a group that attempted to launch an Armenian Studies Center at that time. Details on the center they envisioned are sketchy. In late 1933, a letter was sent out to a list of potentially interested scholars informing them of the committee's basic goals. The letter read, sorry, I skipped over some slides here. You all know about that. Okay. The letter read, "Dear Sir, in a select list of American Oriental scholars, your name has been included as a candidate to become a founder of the Armenian Academy of America, a research society that exists as yet only in the minds of a few individuals interested in the project," and there it would remain. "The aim of this organization is to encourage and foster research in the civilization and culture of the Armenia of the past by becoming a clearinghouse of all research and archaeological discoveries going on in this field in Armenia and other parts of the world, by presenting such results in the internationally known languages, by translations into languages, valuable Armenian documents and literature in general, by establishing scientific periodical publications and annual and quarterly social meetings, a chair of Armenian civilization and culture at some Central American university, not a university in Central America, you understand, but in the United States, such as Columbia, and scholarships and fellowships for specialization in this field, a museum and library of Armenian manuscripts and other valuable writings, and prints and objects useful in research, etc., etc. They didn't lack for vision. If for any reason you cannot be present at the above meeting, the committee will be glad to hear your encouraging remarks and suggestions from you with regard to this enterprise. Yada, yada, yada. Among the scholars and individuals involved were Professor A.V. Williams-Jackson, aforementioned, of Columbia, the Reverend Mr. Benayan, editor of an important Armenian weekly publication, Mr. Andonian, and Archbishop Turian, primate of the Armenian Church in America. Sincerely, William Rockwell, Chairman. In a letter of February 5th, 1934, Vertanes wrote, "Our first meeting was attended besides Mr. Rockwell and myself by 2 other Armenians. So we spent the time mainly in discussing generally the whole plan. We decided to hold another meeting in the spring." According to notes among Vertanes's papers, the 2 other Armenians were Reverend Bedikian, again, and the Reverend Arsen Gurgisian, who I don't really know anything about, although we have some books by him in our library. Vertanes had compiled a list of 37 Orientalists interested in Armenian studies and a list of 25 Armenians interested in Armenian research. It's not known how many individuals were invited to this initial meeting, which was to have taken place again on December 28, 1933, which is to say 3 days after the assassination of Archbishop Turian. What exactly was discussed at this first meeting among these few people? We don't have much information. Only some notes taken by Vertanes for a report which he may or may not have ever written. Under the heading Plan, he has written such entries as excavations in Armenian cities, quarterly journal, translation of Armenian manuscripts, encourage Armenian research fellowship, establish chair at Columbia, etc. In undated notes written sometime after the fact, apparently, Vertanes wrote, "As far as I remember, the meeting of Dr. Rockwell, Reverends Bedikian and Gurgisian and myself, we came to the conclusion that because of the tension arising from Bishop Turian's killing, our project should be postponed indefinitely." It was after that that Reverend Bedikian had the bright idea of starting to teach courses in Armenian at the Extension Department of Columbia, which was the best that could be done of the ambitious program. I myself was never able to pick up my interest in this field because of my researches in early American and European history and because of the Depression, which was the most important factor since all our wealthy men tightening up on gifts. Thus, the first attempt to launch Armenian studies on a permanent basis in the U.S. fell victim to the bitter divisions in the Armenian community and to the economic hardships that affected everyone. It would not be until after World War II that another attempt would be made, and it is here that Vartan Matiosian capably picks up the story in his article, which I will not repeat. It's in the big book that we have in the bookstore, From Paris to Fresno, Armenian Studies in honor of Tikran Kulunjan. But the creation of the Armenian American Cultural Association and its short-lived publication, The Armenian Quarterly, in 1946, under the leadership of Gostan Zaryan, represents another landmark in the growth of Armenian studies in the U.S., and it is significant, as Matiosian suggests, that the connection between the association and the quarterly with the ARF entity, the Armenian National Committee, may have been what doomed the undertaking to be viewed as a purely partisan project. The first notable undertaking of the association was the October 20th, 1945 Symposium on Armenian Culture at Columbia, in conjunction with the Department of Eastern European Languages, and featuring talks by André Gregoire, Serapi Dernesessian, Julian Monfante, and Gostan Zaryan, with music by Alan Hovanes and Aram Khachaturian. Bishop Tiran Mirsoyan offered concluding remarks. The symposium program announced the formation of the association. The association, it reads, was organized by a number of recognized scholars to foster and promote the study and research in the language, literature, art, history, and culture of Armenia, to acquaint the American public and individuals and institutions devoted to the study and research of culture in general. The association hopes to establish in America a center for the study of Armenian culture. It also announced the forthcoming journal, the Armenian Quarterly, which in addition to its articles contained the bylaws of the association, clearly spelling out their plans in some detail. The level of mistrust of the association in anti-ARF circles is indicated in a letter written the day following the symposium by, once again, our friend Avadis Darunian, John Roy Carlson, to Bishop Tiran Mirsoyan. The letter reads, in part, and one needs to bear in mind that Darunian Carlson was not an impartial observer of this. So his opinion is, he's coming from a decided political perspective here. He writes, I regret that my first letter to you should deal with a subject which some consider sensitive, but which to me is part of my work. Some of us develop an intuitive grasp of the potential dangers in a given situation and cannot rest until a solution is recommended. The meeting of the Armenian Cultural Association was such an episode. You called it a sacred occasion. May I respectfully term it a potentially explosive occasion. Darunian proceeds to give details about Zaryan and the association's vice president Vahan Kalandarian's Dashnag ties and proclivities. He continues. I wonder, my dear sir, if you realize that the backing of the Armenian American Cultural Association is thoroughly Dashnag. I cannot conceive Zaryan and Kalandarian conceiving it themselves. Zaryan has a command of himself and of language. I doubt if Mr. Kalandarian can be said to have control of anything. I'm not impressed, which convinces me all the more that he's being used as a front by Dashnag elements. How has the society been financed so far? Who will be its real editors? With its Dashnag backing, what guarantee do Armenian Americans have that it will not eventually develop into a high-toned Dashnag propaganda organ? So, evidently, the time was not yet ripe for such an undertaking to enjoy anything like community-wide support. Around the same time that the Armenian National Committee and the Associated Armenian American Cultural Association were being developed, a parallel entity. Because it's an Armenian project, there have to be parallel creations. Also appeared on the scene. The Armenian National Council of America. You can see how this gets confusing. You have the Armenian National Committee, and the Armenian National Council, and the Armenian American Cultural Association. The council was formed from a union of the ADL, the Armenian Progressive League, and the Social Democrat Hunchakian Party. It did not, as far as I have been able to discover, have a well-defined program for Armenian studies per se, but given the involvement of our friend, the Reverend Charles Vertanes, it is not altogether surprising that it evolved in that general direction. The most tangible contribution the council made in the realm of Armenian studies was the short-lived 1949-50 journal, Armenian Affairs. I should mention that the Armenian Quarterly, which we saw a few minutes ago, made it through 2 issues. The Armenian Affairs made it through 3. So, you can take that however you like. It was edited by Charles Vertanes, and I think it must have been conceived of as a retort to the initially stridently pro-ARF Armenian Review, which was created around the same time, 1948, I think the review began. Like the review in its early years, Armenian Affairs was a mix of the scholarly and the unapologetically partisan. It had numerous notable scholars connected with it, either as advisors or authors, or both, including Sirakli Dernersessian, Arshak Safrastian, Jane Wingate, Zabel Boyajian, and two other individuals connected with the 1933 effort, A.A. Badikian and Arsen Gurgisian. Mamigonian, who several years later would be one of the founders of NAASR, as I think has become clear at this point, served as an editorial assistant on the third and final double issue, and I wonder if you remember that. Among Vertanes's papers are plans for and letters pertaining to an anticipated fourth issue, but it never emerged. The Armenian National Council deserves more than a passing mention in a history of Armenian American affairs of the 1940s and 50s. For a period of about 5 years, it was quite active. It published numerous pamphlets relating to the post-World War II effort to attach the Kars-Ardahan region to Soviet Armenia, which would have had repercussions for Taner, certainly, if no one else. They presented this memorandum to the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco. The ARF also presented a similar document. It must have been a very confusing time for the non-Armenians in San Francisco. But numerous other pamphlets were published during this period of the late 40s. And the book, Armenia Reborn, which I think we still probably have copies of, it's that purple book that we had a copy of at our house. It's very unabashedly pro-Soviet in its tone. They organized public events, most notably a rally for the Armenian cause at Carnegie Hall, where the keynote speaker was the senator from, of all places, New Hampshire. Not because of the large Armenian population in New Hampshire, I can assure you. And the World Armenian Congress, which was held in 1947, which was, again, a mixture of the academic and the political. My sense is that the Council's pro-Soviet leanings doomed it as the Cold War developed in earnest, although it continued to function for some years, and I think it would be good if one day its history can be more fully explored. The year 1948 saw the rebirth of Armenian Studies at Columbia University with the appointment of Dr. Armen Derejian and the formation thereafter of the Society for the Advancement of Armenian Studies in America. The Armenian Mirror Spectator, January 3rd, 1948, carried a lengthy article on the front page by Professor Martinet of the Columbia Department of Linguistics announcing Derejian's appointment as visiting lecturer in the Department of Indo-Iranian and Comparative Linguistics. He proclaimed this as good news for all those instructors and students of the university who have long felt the need of a specified and extensive teaching of an important branch of the Indo-European language family, who have missed accurate and first-hand information about the achievements of an old and fine culture. It will be good news for those who are already have some knowledge of modern Armenian and want to become better acquainted with the cultural and historical background to which the Armenian language has for centuries been the medium. He provides a detailed biography of Derejian, who was born in Lebanon and studied in Brussels under Adams. Having come to the U.S. for the previously mentioned World Armenian Congress, he set himself the task of realizing in this country what he had planned for Brussels, namely, the organization of an Armenian center as part of a well-known learned institution. Negotiations with Columbia University resulted in his appointment. There can be little doubt that Dr. Derejian's Columbia chair, he writes, it was not yet a chair, can be the nucleus of an important center of Armenian studies, provided our young colleague receives active support from the members of the Armenian community in the United States, which indeed may have been the problem. According to a 1955 report, at Columbia University since 1948, about 300 registrations were taken for Armenian Studies. Most students were prepared for scholarly research or for teaching. The success of the Armenian courses at Columbia and the efforts of SAAS, the Society for Advancement of Armenian Studies, prepared the ground in the other communities, colleges, and universities for fostering of the Armenian Studies. It's not very well written. Columbia and SAAS not only inspired and encouraged the others, but also furnished the teaching materials to Wayne University, materials and teachers to Clark University, and became the direct factual archetype of the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, which is working in cooperation with Harvard. Now, having discussed this with a little bit with Manuk and also with Haik Dermanwelian, they beg to differ. But anyway, it was a long time ago, and this is their story, and they're sticking with it. Columbia is not the sole objective of SAAS. It strived and will strive to make of America the scientific center of Armenian studies and research works. It will continue to create and support Armenian courses or chairs in the high schools, colleges, and universities without neglecting parochial or national schools. It will cooperate with every community or group that wants to foster the Armenian studies and research works. SAAS has started a $50,000 endowment fund campaign for the Armenian chair at Columbia University. $10,245 has been collected already. In the spring semester of 1954, Geregian was also commuting to Worcester, where he was a lecturer in Clark University's Evening College. This visiting lectureship was supported by the Committee for Armenian Studies in Worcester, which was formed in April 1954. It appears that due to insufficient enrollment and a poor response to fundraising efforts, by fall of 1955, the nascent program at Clark was effectively dead, not to be revived for nearly half a century when the Kalustyan Mugar chair was established. In light of this, the committee's motto, "You've been waiting for this a long time," is somewhat poignant. Geregian and the NAASR leadership were in communication as early as the summer of 1954, before NAASR had even been launched publicly, and meetings between the two took place in the fall. A letter of January 8, 1955, from NAASR Secretary Jack Gouveia states, "We appreciate the work you have outlined for your society in New York, but we also recognize that the general aims and spirit of our two groups are one. Despite your views of December 17th to Thomas Amirian and Mamigonian that each society should go its own way, we feel that unity will strengthen our common aims. Our purpose is not divided, and the establishment of centers of Armenian learning and research in more than one academic center is a likely possibility. Our society to announce publicly by the end of this month its formation and its program to work for the early establishment of an endowed chair at Harvard. Of necessity, this program would have to be directed from Boston. Our hope is that you will reconsider your views that both organizations should carry on their activities separately. We trust that it will still be possible in the remaining time that our groups can merge into one organization." Of course, such a merger, while logical and probably desirable, did not occur. And in 1959, in the immediate aftermath of the completion of NAASR's $300,000 drive to endow the Harvard chair, Geregian wrote to Chairman Young, "We are happy to know that the plans for the endowment of a chair at Harvard University have been crowned with such success. The committee in New York feels that now is the proper time for us to put in effect similar plans, which, as you know, have long been in our minds, to raise a similar fund at Columbia University. The committee hopes that you can help us in the same manner you did at the Committee for Harvard University. We would like to confer with you on this matter, and we invite you to New York at your earliest convenience to meet the members of the committee." Clearly, the SAAS and Columbia Armenian program did not lack for ambition or potential, but the undertaking seems to be nearly forgotten today. In fact, just before talk tonight, I was talking to Lucy Dermanwelian, who remembered meeting Professor Geregian years ago, and how he's been largely forgotten. And I would say that he's effectively disappeared from Columbia's own presentations of the history of Armenian studies at the university. By the time Nina Garsoyan began teaching at Columbia in 1962 as visiting professor, the Society for the Advancement of Armenian Studies appears to have died out. In 1965, NAASR's own decade-long support of the Armenian Studies program at Columbia began, And in 1979, a chair was established by a donor, not by NAASR, but by another donor. There seems to be little doubt that by the early 1950s, momentum was increasing towards the establishment on some kind of solid basis of Armenian studies in the U.S. Mano Young has told me that he recalls an attempt to establish a program at Princeton in the early 1950s, which is an intriguing possibility given its later development into a stronghold of a certain type of Turkish studies. But I don't have any details about this. In addition to the fledgling Columbia program and the efforts of Professor Fry to continue the work of Blake at Harvard, there was also activity at Cornell and at Wayne University in Michigan. According to a September 17, 1953 article in the Hieronique Weekly, Cornell, quote, since November 1952 offered courses in the Armenian language to its students. The author of the article, Khosrov Nersesyan, notes that Cornell is one of the 3 colleges which carry Armenian language courses, the others being Columbia and Wayne in Detroit. An attempt to establish such a field of study at Harvard recently failed. I'm not totally clear what this latter reference means exactly. The article goes on to note, this is before NAASR was established. The article goes on to note that at Cornell, the Armenian language teaching assignment is handled by 2 thoroughly capable intellectuals, Jack Karapatyan and H. Saninian, both of whom are well known to readers of the Hieronique, English, and Armenian language organs through their articles and stories. However, all was not well. The author writes, unfortunately, it was sorely apparent that no students of Armenian parentage were numbered among those studying the Armenian language. Inquiry of the 2 teachers brought out the information that all attempts on their part to interest Armenian students at Cornell in learning their mother tongue have met with failure. This even despite the fact that the university is prepared to hand out scholarships to those who might wish to study the Armenian language. The author then goes on to chastise the Armenian youth. There are indications that this disinterest on the part of the Armenian students in their mother language will continue unless we do all we can to shame, yes, shame them into registering for the Armenian course. But speed is of the utmost importance here. I learned with the utmost trepidation that the university has been forced to decide that unless 8 to 9 students register this coming year, the Armenian language course, that field of study, will have to be done away with. The gauntlet has been tossed squarely at the feet of the many Armenian students who will register at Cornell this fall. Will they rally to the support of the language of their parents or forefathers? Will they register for a 1-hour course in language whose worth is second to none? Or will they allow this valiant effort to push ahead the teaching of that language die out? Well, I won't keep you hanging. The answer appears to be self-evident, and I don't know whether Armenian classes were held in the fall of 1953 or whether they came to an end later, but they certainly came to an end. It did not endure at Cornell. What was absent at Cornell and elsewhere were permanent programs, endowed programs. The creation of such programs would take a lot of money and effort, and one is led to conclude that the political division of the community at the time was still too severe to produce an effort that had the full backing of the community. It was into this not quite total void that a group that initially also called itself the Society for the Advancement of Armenian Studies, which suggests that they were not aware of the New York group, entered. Prior to its public launch, the name was changed to the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. We sometimes call it NAASR. With similar objectives in most respects to its various forerunners, and facing the same community difficulties, it was able to succeed relatively quickly, within 5 years of its founding, in its first major goal, the funding of an endowed chair in Armenian Studies at Harvard. It is possible, I think, that NAASR was the beneficiary of fortuitous timing in the sense that it arose in time to capitalize on the Cold War era growth of area studies, which developed after World War II in response to the changing post-colonial world, a world in which the U.S. was seen to be competing with, in particular, the Soviet Union for influence. It may well be that this is the reason that Harvard and other universities showed an institutional interest in Armenian studies that they might not have shown at an earlier time, and which, perhaps, they may no longer have in a post-Cold War world. Nonetheless, there are numerous reasons why NAASR's success was hardly a foregone conclusion. One has to think back to what was going on in the Armenian American community in 1955 when NAASR and the campaign for the chair were launched. In 1956, the Prelacy Diocese Schism officially came into being. But that was only a formal recognition of what had been happening for more than 20 years, especially since the Turian assassination in 1933. The Tashnag press vilified the Ramgavar press vilified the Tashnags, and the vilification was done in the most inflammatory possible language. If you ever looked at the newspapers from this era, you know what I'm talking about. In 1955, the Armenian American community was in a state approaching open warfare. We have already seen how earlier efforts failed, at least partly due to partisan political strife. Consequently, when NAASR was launched publicly in March 1955, there could not have been many who anticipated that it would succeed where the others had failed. In an early announcement, it was stated that, quote, the founding members decided that there is a need for a national organization of many purposes for the advancement of Armenian studies in America. They further decided that the first major task that needs to be undertaken in order to place Armenian studies on a scholarly and continuing basis in America is to work for the establishment of an endowed professorship or chair for Armenian studies at a leading university. Harvard was identified as the location of that first chair, and it was hoped that the necessary $300,000 could be raised within 3 years. It took a little longer than that, but not that much longer, and more than 3,000 people made contributions. It has to be kept in mind that there had never been a chair established at Harvard University through the kind of community-wide effort led by NAASR. In 1958, as the campaign neared its close, Sir Hamilton A.R. Gibb, then the director of Harvard's Center for Middle Eastern Studies, wrote to NAASR Chairman Young that, quote, it will be, I believe, the first chair to be founded in this way in America, and that fact itself gives the chair additional and piercing significance. How all this came to pass may be briefly narrated. Some of you lived through it, some of us didn't. So some of you know the story as participants, some of us know it as researchers. In April 1954, Mamigonian of Boston, who at that time was working on a graduate degree in history at Clark University in Worcester, was chairman of the program committee of the Boston branch of the Armenian Studies Association. He invited Professor Richard Fry to address the Boston group. Fry's talk was entitled The Study of Armenian History, Language, and Culture, Its Need and Importance. And in it he declared, the Armenians have a long and rich heritage that is deserving of world recognition. Yet this is unknown to most of the world. Armenian needs to be an established and respected discipline in the universities and should receive the same status and recognition as Arabic and Persian. And Fry called for the elimination of Armenian Americans' ghetto mentality. A refrain he has sounded down to this day. And if you were here tonight, he would say it again, I am sure. Following Fry's talk, spurred by his remarks, Young had conversations with Ara Avakian and Thomas Amirian about how best to achieve the goals that Fry had outlined. Coincidentally, one day at Professor Fry's office, Young encountered Van Arroyen, who is in the audience tonight and a long-serving member of NAASR's board of directors, where Van too had been speaking with Fry about the need for establishing a permanent Armenian program. Thus, the NAASR group of 3 founders, Young, Amirian, and Avakian, came together, and a lengthy memo was sent to Fry describing a possible course of action towards the establishment of a chair or a program in Armenian studies at Harvard. After the Armenian Students Association was approached and elected not to take on the task of leading this effort, it was decided that a new entity would have to be created. A group of 9, Amirian, Avakian, and Young, were joined by Richard Malkasian, Jack Gouveyan, James Etmekjian, Yegishe Charakian, Hagder Manuelian, and Richard Fry, met throughout 1954-55, and by the time of NAASR's public launch in March 1955, some 60 Armenian Americans and academics had joined the association, among them notable members of the Harvard faculty, such as Professor Roman Jakobson, Michael Karpovich, and William Langer, who has been mentioned already. There is not time to give an exhaustive account of NAASR's activities in its early years of existence, but there are a few stops on the chronology I would like to highlight. The first is the March 2nd, 1955 first public meeting of the association at Phillips Brooks House at Harvard, which was attended by more than 200 people. We are fortunate that someone was running a tape recorder that evening, So that rather than listening to me talk about it, I would like to take a few minutes to let you hear a little of what was said that evening more than 54 years ago. Bear with me for one moment.
I have
Whoops.
the pleasure of being the chairman for the Good evening. Good evening. I am Ara Avakia, and I am sure that if you were in my place, you would be just as happy as I am now to greet you, and so pleased to see that we were faced with this trivial little problem of setting up more chairs, which is always a good thing. This is a very exciting moment for us, because in a sense it is, it is a breathless sort of moment. It is a heart-beat skipping sort of experience that we feel. The society has been formed as a result of a need which has been strong enough to create an environment that caused people to come together to satisfy this particular need. And we have called you here tonight because things you have said in the past, things that you write, the way you feel, and we have heard you in expressing yourself, lead us to believe that you want to be interested, or you want to be a part of this association, which has just been formed, and we call it the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, the NAASR. Some of us have already come to the point of calling it intimately NAASR. You must, of course, have a name for it. Well, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. We are ready to launch it, and you are here because you are probably ready to become its charter members. The association has been established, as I told you, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. It has elected a temporary board of directors, and it has elected a temporary chairman. Your chairman for the evening tonight, the temporary chairman of the association, will take over in a moment. He will take over the chair, and I introduce to you Mr. Mamigonian. Thank you, Ara. I have the pleasure of being the chairman for the meeting this evening, and I have, right from the beginning, even before, a feeling of frustration. A feeling of frustration because we have so much to tell you and so little time in which to tell you. As Ara has mentioned, we have been in the works for almost 6 to 8 months. We have had innumerable meetings. I think if we add them up, they come to over 30 meetings. We have given many precious hours. Some of our members have taken precious time away from their families, their children, and their work in order to bring this organization along to the point we have today. On one of the sheets that you have in front of you, you will find listed the purposes and objectives of this organization. I might say that we started out with a specific goal in mind, the goal of seeing established at a university like Harvard a professorship or chair of Armenian Studies, a permanent professorship, or permanent chair, a chair that would be in existence today, tomorrow, 50 years from now, or 500 years from now, God willing. A chair which could be the means for fostering research and studies and publication. And we feel that the Harvard chair is the number one objective, the most important objective, and the people of Greater Boston have a singular opportunity to make this chair a reality As the evening develops, you will hear more about the chair. You'll hear more about how we hope to establish it. You'll hear more about what we expect you, as members of the Armenian and American community, to do. And I'm sure when the end of the evening comes, you will join with us in trying to make this a reality. The next speaker that we have on the program is a young man. I hope he doesn't mind my referring to him as a young man, because I think he will verify this when he gets up, who has cut quite a path already in the field of Armenian studies and Middle Eastern studies. Professor Blake got a hold of him one day and said, "Now look, you are expecting to be a scholar in Persian history and language. How can you be a scholar in this field without knowing Armenian?" But whether he liked it or not, he had to study Armenian. And he didn't learn the Armenian you and I speak at home. He learned Kanafa, the very difficult classical Armenian. He tells me that he sweated many hours over this language to master it to the point that he was able to translate a very important and valuable document later on. This, I think, was his last language. He had by this time mastered some 12 languages. Armenian became the last one, the crowning achievement, as it were. I think we are very grateful that he did finally get to the Armenian, because if there's any one man who has probably been a gadfly in our midst, trying to get this thing going, I think it is the next speaker. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce to you Professor Richard M. Fry of Harvard University.
I must apologize for my miserable voice this evening. I have quite a bad cold. So I hope you can hear me in the back of the room. Now, when Mr. Young asked me to say a few words this evening, he suggested that I not say anything about philological gymnastics, as I did once before, such as trying to derive a Turkish eşek from Armenian, or to talk about such things as the differences between the Metz Tagavor Hayot and Tagavor Metzat Hayot in the relation to the Middle Persian inscriptions. So I told him, all right, I'll talk very generally then about Armenian history and about Armenian studies in this country very briefly, such as they are now. Now, frequently I am asked, well, is there anything really to be done in Armenian? I mean, in Armenian history and literature, classical Armenian. Haven't all of the classics been translated? Haven't all of them been studied time and time again? Well, unfortunately, the answer is no, not by a long shot. As a matter of fact, we don't even have decent and I mean adequate editions of the Armenian classics. So there's a considerable amount of work to be done. And as far as the translations go, or studies of classics, we're only just beginning. But this is a rather specialized work, of course. Addition of texts and translations, the study of history. What about general considerations of Armenian history? Well, as far as work to be done is concerned, there again we are abysmal in our ignorance. But my concern, as many of you have heard before, is not so much with Armenia simply as Armenian history. Somebody may well ask, well, all right, this is who's really interested in Armenian history except a few of the old people, not even the young people are interested in Armenia anymore. Armenian descent. But this Armenia is not a question for just Armenians. It's a part of world history. And this is something which I've been trying to push time and time again, that Armenia has a great deal to offer to world history. I wish to emphasize and re-emphasize again that the history of Armenia is something not only of significance or of interest to those who are solely interested in Armenian history, but it has very great relevance indeed to the history of the Near East, and if you will, to world history of the time.
So again, if Professor Fry were here tonight, I suspect he would say almost the exact same thing that he said 55 years ago. We're very fortunate to have a lot of old recordings of some of the very early NAASR programs. They're quite interesting. By June 1955, the organization had grown to more than 250 members. In the fall of 1955, 54 years ago tomorrow, the association had its kickoff banquet at the Harvard Club in Boston. And these are some pictures from them. Among those speaking at the banquet were Harvard President Nathan Pusey, Lieutenant Governor Sumner G. Whittier, and author William Saroyan. Saroyan hailed the campaign with his characteristic understatement as the best thing that has come along in the community in generations, and said that the success of the program would bring an end to the helpless longing of the human heart for an orderly truth. I'm not sure what he meant, frankly, but yeah, he was a great writer. Chairman Mamigonian presented pledges totaling $30,000, or 10% of the total necessary, to the Harvard Dean of Faculty of Arts and Sciences, McGeorge Bundy. There's a lot of pictures from this period of Mamig handing over money to people, and he always looks happy about it, strangely enough. Fundraising had reached the point by 1957 that Dr. Avadis Kaysanjan was appointed Research Fellow in Armenian Studies at Harvard, the first time in the U.S. that a scholar held a position solely devoted to Armenian studies. Professor Sanjan would remain at Harvard until 1965. Also during this period in 1955 and 56, NAASR organized the first conferences or symposia focusing on the nascent field of Armenian studies in the U.S., Armenian Studies and Research Problems and Needs, and Searchlight on Armenian Studies. Fundraising continued apace throughout the next several years. Though successful, the effort was not without its ups and downs. And NAASR's efforts were denounced by no less than Ruben Darpinyan, then the author of the Hieronyk, who wrote that, in part, quote, "They intend to use this fund for the publication of books and periodicals on Armenian history and literature, which are calculated to defend the Soviet cause, to win the Armenian youth over to the Soviet viewpoint, and as well to give the non-Armenian public a slanted view of the Armenian reality." And those were the nice things he had to say. Such criticism notwithstanding, by spring of 1959, the $300,000 goal was in sight. In May 1959, thanks to a large contribution from the Gulbenkian Foundation, the total raised surpassed the needed $300,000, in fact $388,000, and many who were on hand that night 50 years ago at the victory banquet held at Harvard's Memorial Hall remember the overwhelming sense of achievement among the more than 1,000 people who were there. Many people remember shedding tears of joy and disbelief. It's not something I can do justice to in such a presentation, probably unless you were there. But we do have some nice pictures. Ruben Mamigonian was present, and other notables and dignitaries, including Greg Adamian. Again, Mamig looks happy to be handing over a check, or alternately, he's saying, "There's no way you're going to get this check out of my hand." I'm not sure which. It's difficult today to appreciate the impact of the establishment of the Harvard Chair in 1959. An editorial in the Armenian Mirror Spectator hailed the achievement. This interest has been evident for decades, but the interest in such study is not enough to bring a cohesive program into being. Money was necessary, and the community responded. The establishment of the chair reiterates the desires of scholars in kindred fields for the establishment of such a chair. As an Armenian, you should rejoice in your present accomplishment. Just as an Armenian, you must clearly realize the effort necessary to carry on the multitude of projects which NAASR will indulge in now that their first goal has been reached. A lamentable void has been filled, and NAASR's role in the filling of this lamentable void is to be hailed by every single scholar today, let alone every Armenian in the world today. Sanjan continued at Harvard, but was never took the chair until 1965. And in 1969, Professor Robert W. Thompson, who began teaching at Harvard in 1963 as a language teacher, was appointed to the chair, a position he held until the early 1990s when he took the Gulbenkian chair at Harvard. Thompson was succeeded by Professor James Russell, who still holds the chair and is seated in the back of the room tonight. And in 1980, the chair was named the Mashtad's chair. I'd like to just pause for an aside here before we wind down. What was the secret of NAASR's success? Going through the photographs, I've come to a conclusion. This was the secret to NAASR's success. Graphs and charts. And I've devised a graph here, a rough estimate of NAASR expenditures in the early years, showing that an overwhelming percentage of NAASR monies were spent, in fact, on charts and graphs. So, sorry about that. Not true. Somebody's going to end up quoting me in the newspaper, and NAASR's efforts to establish a second chair in Armenian Studies on the West Coast constitute the final part of this narrative, and I must confess it is a chapter that must get somewhat short shrift, not only because it's getting late, but because I'm simply not as well informed yet on this aspect of NAASR's activities. So in brief, NAASR had established a West Coast section in 1957, which functioned under the direction of Dr. J. Michael Hagopian. And in June 1960, it was announced that UCLA would be the site of the second Armenian Studies chair. In 1962, an agreement was reached between NAASR and UCLA, whereby NAASR and UCLA would raise $200,000 to establish a chair for Armenian Studies. It was agreed that $150,000 would be provided within 5 years and the balance within 3 years thereafter, and that UCLA would establish and fund the chair with a regular budgeted tenure faculty position. Courses in Armenian began in 1960, and were taught by a succession of temporary appointees until the hiring of Sanjan in 1965. NAASR's California chapters began organizing events to call public attention to the organization and its campaign for the chair. Lectures were given by well-known figures such as author and translator Aram Tolikian, Richard Hovhanessian, and others. By the May 1963 UCLA kickoff banquet, nearly $30,000 had been raised. Once again, the process was not without difficulties. Some in the California community clearly resented the intrusion of meddling Easterners. There was a certain Yankee go home attitude prevalent. The California Courier editor George Mason, in a rather pointed commentary piece on February 1962 entitled "Easterners are fine, but they don't realize we have schools," the title of which is more or less self-explanatory, complained that NAASR is asking for a capital fund, the interest from which can be used for educational projects. And what began as a fine and simple organization, which only was going to ask for money to get a chair at Harvard, is now becoming a huge Goliath that plans to perpetuate itself in perpetuity. Amen, brother. The message, though, was clear. Stay in the East and let us worry about the West. Also, at the same time, efforts unrelated to NAASR were ongoing to establish a program at UC Berkeley. It was reported in October 1961 in the California Courier that the Society for Armenian Studies, not to be confused with the Society for Armenian Studies, which now exists, has been reactivated this year at the University of California. Secretary Alice Abegyan stated that one of the aims of the society was establishing a chair of Armenian studies at the university, which it has succeeded in doing, except that it hadn't. Among those present at the first meeting were Armenologist Dr. Paul Esabal, professor of Armenian language and civilization at the university. However, the program did not become permanent until the establishment of the William Saroyan visiting professorship in the 1990s. The Courier reported in December that a $5,000 grant from the Gulbenkian Foundation to Berkeley for library materials, and also stated that during its first 2 years, the program has been aided by a grant of $20,000 from the Armenian Educational Foundation. However, by May 1962, the program was dropped due to under-enrollment and lack of outside funding. By 1969, $150,000 had been raised and a chair in Armenian studies was established at UCLA with Sanjan as the first occupant. A decade later, the chair would be named for Naragazi. In the same year, Professor Richard Hovannessian, who had been teaching at UCLA for several years already, was hired to teach Armenian history on a full-time basis. Eventually, Hovannessian's position would become an endowed chair funded by the same Armenian Educational Foundation, and Hovannessian would more or less go on to establish the study of modern Armenian history in the U.S. In the 40 years since the filling of these first two chairs, it's that anniversary too, additional endowed chairs, visiting professorships, lectureships, and centers have been established at other universities such as Columbia, the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor and at Dearborn, California State University Fresno, Tufts University, University of Chicago, University of California, Berkeley, Clark University, University of Southern California, and Boston University. At present, the two chairs that we refer to sometimes somewhat proprietarily as the NAASR chairs, which is to say the Mashdots chair at Harvard and the Naragazi chair at UCLA, are filled by the immediate successors of Thompson and Sanjan, that is, James Russell at Harvard and Peter Cowie at UCLA. We are lucky to have such fine scholars and worthy successors to the first generation of chairholders. At an early NAASR gala at Harvard in the 1950s, Harvard President Pusey declared that the effects of the establishment of the chair might not be felt for 100 years. This was probably a bitter pill to swallow for the many in the audience who had given their money and wanted to see immediate results. And it may be that there are still some in the community who are disappointed that the creation of chairs at Harvard, UCLA, and other universities has not had the impact that they might have wished for. But let's be honest. It's not rational to expect the existence of these programs to have addressed all of the needs of the Armenian American community, nor to expect the scholars to lead all battle charges. To expect them to do so is to misunderstand the function of the scholar. However, the fact is, and as I've heard Manuk and Haig, Dermanwelian, and others on many occasions say, half a century ago there were no more than a handful of good scholarly works in English on Armenian subjects. Today there are hundreds. A few weeks ago we heard here a very interesting talk by Michael Bobelian that focused mainly on the post-1965 movement in the U.S. for recognition of the Armenian genocide. Mind you, this was largely a spontaneous occurrence, seemingly, in Armenian communities across the world who had had enough of the silence and of the lies. But passion and activism are important. But the fact is, even though everyone more or less knew what had happened in 1965, what had happened in 1915, I should say, the scholarship had not yet been undertaken. The existence of established programs in Armenian studies in the U.S. allowed that process to begin, and it's been ongoing since then. My point is not to dismiss concerns about the field any more than it is to claim that NAASR is responsible for all that is good in Armenian studies today, since that would mean we would have to be responsible for all that is not good too. But when one looks merely at the Harvard chair, since we are marking that anniversary, and one considers the vital historical works, for example, that Professor Thompson has made accessible to English language readers, and his formidable scholarship on those works, and the continuous output of Professor Russell that has expanded our understanding of Armenian language, literature, folklore, art, and religion, I think there is ample basis to be pleased. As for Armenian studies today as a whole, there are also good reasons to be concerned. The great efforts that went into creating this field can be undone through the indifference or worse of universities for whom, and let's not be too surprised at this, Armenian studies is not a top priority. we must all be vigilant. At his installation as the Harvard chair, Professor Thompson gave an eloquent talk entitled "The Hub and the Spoke." In it, he said, "What I must stress is the result of NAASR's work in establishing a chair at Harvard, because it was this endowment which gave permanency and proper standing to Armenian studies, and which for the first time made possible expansion and development of the field. The chair, ladies and gentlemen, is the hub without which there are no spokes or wheel. So, ladies and gentlemen, to you belongs the credit for making possible not merely one man's appointment, but the training of a whole series of scholars who will bring Armenian studies to many universities, both in this country and abroad. As years go on, these programs of Armenian, ever more numerous and widening like ripples in a pool, will reach successive generations of Armenians, and what is more, the non-Armenian world will be brought to respect and honor the manifold achievements of the Armenian people." And so I think it has come to pass. Obviously, the vitally important programs and institutions that exist elsewhere in the diaspora, to say nothing of in Armenia itself, lie outside the scope of this presentation. But I hope I've been able to give some sense of the development and evolution of the field in the U.S. I was speaking last night to Professor Russell, who was about to go to England to give a series of lectures, and he told me that he had shown proper restraint in his lectures and was not going to be including any references to the Doors or any other rock bands or unscholarly things. I thought to myself that I too had shown untypical restraint in writing this presentation, not including any references to Ulysses in my presentation. So I would like to end this this self-imposed restraint and conclude with a line from Ulysses. And John Turner will know what I'm talking about here. And the line is, "He found in the world without as actual what was in his world within as possible." And I think this is what the men and women who established this organization and the field of Armenian studies did. One can say if they had not done it, someone else would have. But the fact is that they did it. They saw the possible, and they made it into the actual. The story of Armenian studies in the U.S. is, as I hope I have made clear, bigger than the story of NAASR, but so too NAASR is a very large part of the story. And so for those who are here tonight who have been part of that, and to those who could not be here who are part of that, and to those who are long gone, I can only tip my hat and say thanks, and let us carry forward what they have established. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, and I'm sorry to have gone on at such length. I'd like to show one 30-second thing that I think is extremely entertaining and sums everything up. Okay, computer? Oh, I've broken the computer. Well, maybe I won't.
Oh, come on.
Oh. Bloody hell.
What? You turned down the volume machine.
It just won't play.
What was it?
Give me a minute.
It says play.
The numbers are going.
Hold on. I'll take questions while I'm, fiddling around. No one wants to ask a question. George does, yes.
Marc, you mentioned various organizations in the development of Armenian studies in North America. Can you comment on what role the AGBU played, and was the AGBU at all supportive in the early days of NAASR? And then I was wondering, how did you happen to decide 1969 as the cutoff of the election?
Let me answer the second question first. Why 69 as the cutoff point? Because I needed to have a cutoff point, first of all. Otherwise, a long talk would have been an interminable one. And because it was in 1969 that the first two chairs were filled. And as from a NAASR perspective, that gave it a nice stopping point. And after that, of course, the chairs and programs proliferate. And I would like the people who are involved in those programs to tell their stories. I have to say, in general, that Armenian organizations, and I suppose we can lump the chairs in there, have not done a very good job of telling their stories. And we can lump NAASR in there too. We have some things throughout our history, but fortunately we have all the material here. But none of the organizations have good histories. It's unfortunate. As far as the AGBU goes, I'm going to have to answer, I don't know that much, except my sense is that the AGBU was supportive of NAASR in the early years. This is more of a question for Manu, but I don't know how actively involved they were. Do you have anything to say on the AGBU and NAASR? No. I don't believe they were a major player. No. Others say no, and I'm confident. Yes, Bob?
Marc, I want to compliment you on a really comprehensive and interesting talk. Unearthing all these movements well before and after. There's one aspect of that I wanted to comment on, namely, and take off from Manu's wonderful reporting. When he says the chair will be here for 50 years,
Yeah.
or maybe even 500 years. And I think behind that was an impulse in the community for self-preservation. And it's it's in the 50s that the Holy Trinity builds the church right in the middle of Yankeeville. And I remember talking to Marc Collegian, and I said, maybe it was General Zartarian, and they're the ones who sort of finance these. And I said, why did you go right on Brattle Street? You're irritating the Yankees and everything. He said, look, I wanted to
That's why, yeah.
that someday, when there are no more Armenians left, that we have a symbol there, and we have a church there, and that we existed. And I think this impulse, the sense of disintegration of a community, absorption of the community, is reflected in Manu's comment and some other things like Soroyan writing in the 30s about, there's a short story called 50,000 Assyrians or something, and he goes to his barbershop and he says, we're Armenians we are being absorbed everywhere, and someday there won't be any limited barbershops. You think we're bad off. There are only 50,000 Assyrians all over the world. But behind all of this, there's a sense of, I think, right from the end of migration, in the 1920s, the sense that the community is being absorbed. And ultimately, this will disappear. Whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Armenia, or Soviet Armenia, or whether it's in the United States. And I think that's one of the impulses that drives the fundraising and the sense that it'll always be there.
I expect you're right, and I hope that someday someone will write a sequel to your book on the early Armenian American community. There is also no history of the Armenian American community that picks up where yours ends, and there needs to be. It's a real problem that could put these sorts of things in a larger perspective. Yes?
I enjoyed this so much, particularly all your speaking, but also the recordings. My name is Judy, and I'm Marc Collegian's daughter. And I just wanted to share a little memory and then ask a question. I have very vivid memories of the early meetings of the founders meeting around the dining room table at my house in Belmont as a kid when I was in elementary school. And my sisters and I used to have no concept what Armenian chairs were. So we would think that people were a little nuts, actually. They don't have to establish Armenian chairs. We have a whole bunch of them around the dining room table. But the room was very much a vibrating kind of room during those meetings, as I recall. I was in elementary school, and I'd be, taking the coffee and the left entrance in and stuff. But the question is, when you were talking about what made for NAASR success, why was NAASR successful? I was wondering, given the how you described the atmosphere of, political polarizations and animosities, was were the founders from different political points of view, and was there a sort of, we're not going to talk about that stuff because we have a mission, or were there really not very many political differences amongst you all, for Van and Mamigonian and Marc, or anybody?
Do you want to speak to that, Lucy?
Yes, I want to make a comment. I think it was a sense of pride, because when Fry spoke to Manuk that there should be a chair at Harvard, I think it spoke to this sense of identity and sense of pride, that would be wonderful. And about chairs, I remember Haig said, my brother Haig, whom you just saw on the screen, he said when they went around fundraising, and people would say, what kind of a chair is it, made of gold? And a lot of people didn't understand at all the concept. But fortunately, some people did. I was living in Washington at that time when it got started. And when I joined as a member, that's great because I'll have a non-Armenian name, so they'll feel prestigious that other people are interested in it. But I remember Haig said that some people got it right away and other people had no idea of the concept of something like this. And I think it just spoke to this sense of identity and pride, even though not many people knew what the contributions of Armenia to Western civilization.
To speak to the political question,
Yeah.
I don't have the full dossiers on all of the original members and founders, but my sense is, from what I've read and from talking to Manuk and others, that there were efforts made to include people from all sides, as it were. Although my sense is that if you were hardcore, probably you weren't going to be, brought into the fold.
Hardcore what? Explain that to me.
I don't know if it's hardcore period on either side or not.
No, it was hardcore on one side.
Hardcore on the ARF
On
side.
the ARF
Gosh knows.
side,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Let's not kid ourselves. I was
hoping to continue kidding myself.
Professor Fry asked me to survey the community. And I think I did a very intensive job on all ends of the spectrum. And I'll say that absolutely at the grassroots level, the consensus was go for it. We need it. Bob's sense is, I think, absolutely accurate. There was this fear, this threat of where we were heading. But I also talked to the leadership at the ARF. And I know that they had very personal animosity towards Manuk and towards Soag and Miriam. And they were seen as leaders of that movement. And that's just a fact. I'm not going to name names.
As I said when I quoted from that Hieronymic Weekly article, honest to God, those were the nice parts that I read. It was a nasty, nasty article, and personal as well. And yes, it certainly, there seemed to be more venom from the ARF side of the community than else.
I also think, Mark, there's an article somewhere in the Armenian Review that talks about the fact that Professor Blake had tried to assess whether there was a consensus back in the 30s.
I see.
And I'm sure that article exists in the Armenian Review, but I don't know where.
I will look into it.
But worth seeking out. And in retrospect, that might also be pointing out that we weren't the first, you see.
James, yes.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for a wonderful lecture. It's interesting to find out something about one's past that one didn't know. Just a few small footnotes. At Columbia, there was another scholar, successor to A.D. Williams Jackson, Louis Gray, a professor of linguistics and of Indo-Iranian, who also did Armenian studies and taught some classes. And Nina Garsoyan bought a lot of his books, his Armenian texts, when he retired, and sold them to Ideal Bookstore across the street from the campus. And although there wasn't a chair as such until the foundation of the Centennial Chair in '79, both Nina and now the very Reverend Father Krikor Maksudyan had been teaching at Columbia since the early 60s. Nina had dovetailed Armenian with Byzantine studies. This was the way that Columbia accepted the field in the beginning. This was the pattern in most places, because I guess there's something that one has to remember when we speak about the prehistory of the field, which is that the Ivy League colleges and a lot of American academia were not quite as diverse as they are today. And Armenians and other minorities were not as welcome in professorial positions as they are today. In the 1930s, for instance, the Peabody Museum at Harvard published a monograph, which you can still buy at the museum, on the question of whether or not Armenians are Aryans, based upon the measurement of their skulls. And, Amnesty International once called and asked me whether the diocese would agree to sign a protest against a violation of human rights in Soviet Armenia in 1979-80. I remember being very defensive about this and saying, yes, we know there are violations of human rights in the Soviet Union, but what do you have to say about Armenians and Armenian rights in general? Why are you focusing on Soviet Armenia, which is all the Armenians have right now? You know? So I remember being very defensive on the sort of red side of this political barrier. And the Dashnaq Tsagans were, of course, defensive on their side, to the degree that when I came up for tenure at Columbia, the late Archbishop Mesropashchian was one of the people spearheading opposition to my appointment. Years later, we became very close friends. And he was a remarkable scholar, a brilliant man. And one of my cherished and saddest memories is that I was the last person he ever spoke to before his heart attack. He spoke on the phone while he was in New York. So the political division harmed all of us in all kinds of ways, which we'll be spending generations trying to unravel. But one of the achievements of the establishment of Armenian programs was breaking through the various glass ceilings that existed against, well, the non-WASP minorities in America. And Professor Thompson once made the point that Armenian studies and success of Armenian studies was part of a larger picture, including things like women's studies, African American studies, that Armenian was part of a kind of a greening, a liberation of a much more diverse, much kinder America than the one we used to know. And I've gone on much too long. Mainly, thank you very much for
Eden, yes.
Yes, I'd just like to make a small point tying what Bob said about Assyrians, of course, and Columbia University, that although you referred to A.D. Jackson, in fact, the person teaching Armenian and Turkish and Persian and Syriac since 1894 was a man named Abraham Yohanan, who held that position of teaching various Middle Eastern languages very, very tenuously, funded from year to year with very, very small amounts of money. And his archives are at Columbia, and I've made a study of them because he is from my part of Iran. And I think what it shows is that the Assyrian community and the Armenian community in northwest Iran were very, very close and bilingual in many cases, shared villages. And when this man came as part of the Bible translation project into Syria, he connected with Columbia, and his material, he produced a lot of material, much of it unpublished, wrote a lot on the genocide, a book published in 1916, in fact. And so he is sort of the forgotten person because he was never a professor, but was mentored by Jackson.
Thank you. Let me play this very brief clip and then we will conclude for refreshment.
59 NAASR board chairman. Young and other NAASR leaders crisscrossed the country raising funds for the Harvard chair.
Here it is.
And so, not too long after we announced the success of the Harvard Chair campaign, not only did we raise $300,000, we raised $388,000. Part of that was a $70,000 grant from the Gulbenkian Foundation.
And I remember when Manug and I we just congratulated, hugged each other afterwards. We said, we've made it. And we had.
That's all.
Just a quick thank you to Marc for an outstanding job. It was just so engaging and insightful. We appreciate all your hard work. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you will stay for refreshments. And I want to acknowledge not only Marc's wife, Michelle, who is here this evening, his mother, Mrs. Mamigonian, and her sister, I believe, and is there anyone else from the family? And his uncle. And we're very happy that you were able to be with us. Again, Marc, thank you for a brilliant job.
Oh, I'm sorry.